Let's jump right in. Picture this. It's 1945, and World War II is finally coming to an end. Across Europe, cities are literally lying in absolute ruin, and the Nazi regime has officially fallen. But behind closed doors, deep within the highly classified, quiet offices of American military intelligence, a very, very different conversation is taking place. Intelligence officers are sitting around tables, actively flipping through the captured files of the exact men who designed Adolf Hitler's most devastating weapons. We're talking about the profiles of men who literally utilized concentration camp prisoners as slave labor to build those very weapons. So the crucial point is, the United States government wasn't asking how to capture and punish these men for their horrific war crimes. No, they were asking an entirely different, frankly chilling question. How do we use them? You see, American intelligence recognized the global landscape was rapidly shifting. They wanted to exploit these specific scientific minds for what would eventually become the space race against the Soviet Union. And this objective set into motion a massive, totally covert initiative that would ultimately bring these men to America, hand them immense resources, and literally have them build the rockets that took humanity to the moon. It's a dark, incredibly complex story that the intelligence community tried really hard to bury. Section 1. A dangerous technological prize. To understand why the U.S. would even consider partnering with these guys, we have to look closely at what Germany actually possessed at the very end of the war. They had, without a doubt, the most advanced rocket and weapons technology in the entire world, and America was absolutely desperate to acquire it before the Soviets could get their hands on it. The ultimate prize in all of this? The V-2 rocket. It was an absolute technological marvel, totally unprecedented in its design, and it was developed largely by aerospace engineer Wernher von Braun. Whoever controlled this specific technology and the minds that built it would instantly gain a massive global military advantage. So, to secure this prize, American intelligence launched a highly classified extraction program. Initially, they called it Operation Overcast, but as the scope of the whole thing expanded, it was quietly renamed Operation Paperclip. But as military intelligence rolled out this extraction program, they hit a devastating roadblock. Most of these highly coveted scientific minds weren't just innocent, passive citizens caught up in a war. They were active, committed, card-carrying members of the Nazi Party. We are talking about men who were fully aware of and often directly managed programs that relied entirely on concentration camp prisoners for brutal forced labor. So faced with this stark moral reality, the American government made a staggering operational choice. Their solution? Simply hide the truth from the American public. Section 2. Bleaching the past. Okay, let's dive into this and look at the exact mechanical process of how American intelligence actually covered this up. At the time, President Harry Truman had actually signed an explicit written order regarding post-war immigration, and that order strictly prohibited the entry of anyone who had been an ardent, meaningful member of the Nazi Party. It was specifically designed to keep war criminals out of the United States. Makes sense, right? But the highly valuable scientists targeted by Operation Paperclip almost universally violated this presidential directive. I mean, they were ardent Nazis. So to get around the president's strict rules, the intelligence community had to get a little creative with the paperwork. The intelligence community completely falsified the records, and they did it systematically in 3 distinct steps. First, entire personal dossiers were just rewritten from scratch, carefully crafting these new sanitized biographies. Second, military and war records were systematically altered to remove any incriminating evidence of forced labor management or war crimes. And third, any mention of active Nazi Party memberships or affiliations with the SS was completely omitted from their official files. They were literally inventing a brand new history for these men out of thin air. This systematic erasure was so deliberate and so incredibly sanitized that we actually have a blunt admission from an intelligence officer from that era. He described exactly what they were doing to the files as bleaching the scientists' pasts. Think about that word. Bleaching. They were wiping the slate totally clean on paper. By bleaching the files, these men suddenly appeared as nothing more than benign technical experts, which allowed them to be quietly and illegally ushered right into the United States without raising a single red flag with immigration authorities. Section 3. The Scientists and Victims. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the sheer scale of the operation. Abstract government policies are one thing, but to truly grasp the gravity of this explainer, we need to look at the massive numbers involved. 1,600. That's the number of German scientists, engineers, and technicians brought over to America under the umbrella of Operation Paperclip. This was not just a handful of isolated rogue experts extracted in the dead of night. This was a massive, systemic pipeline, literally transferring thousands of personnel straight across the Atlantic. And within that massive group, we find the jarring duality of figures like Wernher von Braun. In Germany, his reality was incredibly dark. He was a commissioned officer in the SS and a highly dedicated member of the Nazi Party. He frequently visited the Mittelwerk, this horrific, damp underground factory where his V-2 rockets were built entirely by slave labor. It was a literal nightmare where starved and abused workers died in the thousands just to meet production quotas. But his file was systematically bleached, so in America, he was handed a totally new reality. He was given the resources to design the Saturn V rocket, the actual machine that propelled the Apollo astronauts to the moon. He became a beloved public figure, celebrated to this very day as the brilliant father of the American space program. His victims, meanwhile, they have no such memorial. And this pattern of buried history repeats with guys like Hubert his Strugglehold. His hidden past reveals that he conducted utterly horrific medical experiments on human beings, specifically concentration camp prisoners at Dachau. He placed men in low-pressure chambers to simulate high-altitude conditions, and then just clinically observed them as they agonizingly suffocated to death. Yet his American reality saw him aggressively recruited to help develop the U.S. Air Force's aerospace medicine program. He thrived here in the States, ultimately being named the father of space medicine, completely shielded from the Nuremberg trials. It's just wild to think about. Let's move to and see how this builds, because you can really see how this profound injustice compounds over the passage of time. In the 1940s, Strighold is literally orchestrating deadly suffocation experiments at Dachau. By the 1950s, his past is fully erased, and he is living a highly prestigious life in America, even having a major aerospace medicine award named in his honor. It wasn't until the year 2013, more than 60 years later, if you can believe it, that sustained relentless advocacy from Holocaust survivors finally forced the medical community to look at the actual history and strip his name from that award. For decades, buried records, entirely new identities, and highly respected careers were the absolute norm for these men.
Section 4. Justifying the unthinkable.
So you're probably wondering, how exactly did the highest levels of the American government rationalize these incredibly dark decisions? It's a question that lingered for years. Well, today, decades later, declassified internal records reveal the true, sweeping extent of the cover-up. These documents firmly prove that officials at the highest levels of government were fully and comprehensively aware of the scientists' backgrounds. This wasn't some clerical mistake. The Joint Chiefs of Staff approved it, the newly formed CIA was deeply involved in the orchestration, they knew exactly who they were bringing over and exactly what those men had done. Their primary justification for this massive ethical breach? The dawn of the Cold War. The persistent argument popping up in all the intelligence briefings was that the Soviet Union was actively capturing their own German scientists, creating this zero-sum race for technological supremacy. The military brass basically argued that the survival of the free world demanded deeply uncomfortable, pragmatic choices. But, the most damning detail of this entire operation is this. The families of the concentration camp victims were never consulted. The survivors of Mittelwerk and Dachau were never told that their tormentors were basically being handed lucrative government contracts. They were entirely factored out of the government's equation.
Section 5. A complicated legacy.
Look, history is rarely a simple, comforting story of just heroes and villains. Very often, it's a remarkably complicated story of choices, and those choices carry massive, deeply uncomfortable consequences that echo for generations. When looking at Operation Paperclip, we are forced to hold a profoundly difficult duality. And this brilliantly illustrates the core conflict. The work of these scientists unequivocally contributed to monumental human achievements, directly aiding in putting Neil Armstrong on the moon. At the exact same time, Operation Paperclip effectively shielded active war criminals from ever facing justice. The very same administrative paperclip that attached America to extreme scientific opportunity also permanently attached the nation to extreme unforgivable crimes. Both of these conflicting realities are true at the exact same time, and both things matter immensely. I want to leave you with a really provocative question to consider. Does achievement erase complicity? The magnificent Saturn V rocket that carried humanity away from Earth and into the stars was ultimately designed by a man who stood by and watched starving prisoners build his earlier rockets. And he said absolutely nothing. That is not a comfortable fact to sit with. But the absolute least we can do to honor the past is to ensure we know exactly what happened. and exactly what it cost. I'll leave you to reflect on that. Thanks for joining me for this explainer.